Okay, uh, it all worked out after the back and forth for almost 6 months. With 48 chapters in the book of Ezekiel, we are ending tonight on class number 48. So we perfectly averaged one class per chapter, though like tonight, sometimes we covered more, sometimes we covered less. And we are tonight going to try to get through chapters 47 and 48, finish up the text of Ezekiel in tonight's class. If we have some catch up to do on Sunday, that's fine. But Sunday we'll start doing some review, some reflection on Ezekiel, do that for a class or two. We're pretty open right now, actually. We're in no rush, but we also don't want to waste anybody's time. So we'll try to use the next 2 or 3 class periods as effectively as possible before starting 2 weeks from tonight, the book of Daniel, here on Wednesdays. Well, let's jump into Ezekiel and the class tonight, 47 and 48. So the first part of chapter 47, I think, is going to be one of the coolest passages in the book, honestly. And especially in this section of 40 to 48 that's been a little bit confusing, hard to read at times. These few dozen verses or so at the beginning of 47 are going to be very refreshing, pun intended, there. So we'll talk about that, probably maybe spend most of our time talking about this. Other passages related and talk about its significance to us. The rest of the text tonight is going to deal with the tribal divisions in this new land, this envisioned land of Ezekiel, where the tribes have their land. We'll talk about that, overview that, and then hopefully when you leave tonight, if we get there, you can walk out of here having memorized the last 4 words of the book of Ezekiel, which are easy to remember and very, very significant in the larger message of the book. Well, let's jump into to this section here in which Ezekiel in chapter 40 to 48 is seeing a vision. And it's a vision of a temple is what we remember. But as we've seen, the description of the temple really only makes up a portion of this vision. There is much of the vision devoted to other things, not just the temple, but what's going on in the temple, who's serving, the kind of work that they do, and even broader than that, what this new society looks like. And as we'll see tonight, what the land looks like, again, not just around the temple, but even broader out in the rest of Israel. So, the order of what we've seen is that in the first few chapters of the vision, the space was described, what is where, and the designated places. So the walls, the gates, the specific location of the sanctuary, and then the most holy place, rooms and chambers all around that serve various purposes. But there's a lot of dimensions in these first 3 chapters of the vision. And then in the next couple chapters, we see God filling that space himself with his glory, the cloud of his glory. And we also see more of the goings on in the temple, the altar, and many of the offerings that are described for the altar in the temple, and then the people, the prince, the Levites, the priests who are operating within the temple and the work that they are about. But as we've said, we're now zooming out to see kind of the whole nation, the people, what the people are about, what God requires of this people in this newly envisioned land. And as we'll see tonight, even the nature of the land itself. Okay, let's jump in. Chapter 47, here's what we're going to do. We're going to read the first 12 verses, and then I'll go ahead and give you the question now. This is the question that you're going to be discussing amongst yourselves for the next several minutes after we read the text. I want you guys to do most of the work tonight, actually. Make my life easy. So this is going to be your first task, is to think up and discuss together what Bible passages you are reminded of, any kind of connection that comes to your brain, as you read these first 12 verses of Ezekiel 47. So let's read, and then I'll give you time to discuss with each other. Ezekiel 47, verse 1. Then he brought me back to the door of the temple, and behold, water was issuing from below the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east. The water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar. Then he brought me out by the way of the north gate and led me around on the outside to the outer gate and that faces toward the east. And behold, the water was trickling out on the south side. Going on eastward with a measuring line in his hand, the man measured 1,000 cubits. Then led me through the water, and it was ankle deep. Again he measured 1,000, and led me through the water, and it was knee deep. Again he measured 1,000, and led me through the water, and it was waist deep. Again he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not pass through, for the water had risen. It was deep enough to swim in, a river that could not be passed through. And he said to me, Son of man, have you seen this? Then he led me back to the bank of the river. And as I went back, I saw on the bank of the river very many trees on the one side and on the other. And he said to me, This water flows toward the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah and enters the sea. When the water flows into the sea, the water will become fresh. And wherever the river goes, every living creature that swarms will live, and there will be many fish. For this water goes there, that the waters of the sea may become fresh, so everything will live where the river goes. Fishermen will stand beside the sea, from En-gedi to Eneglaim. It will be a place for the spreading of nets. Its fish will be of very many kinds, like the fish of the great sea. But its swamps and marshes will not become fresh, for they are to be left for salt. And on the banks, on both sides of the river, there will grow all kinds of trees for food. Their leaves will not wither, nor their fruit fail, but they will bear fresh fruit every month, because the water for them flows from the sanctuary. Their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for healing. Okay, take the next 5 minutes or so, discuss with people around you, try to make as long a list as you can of passages you are reminded of, other verses, stories, etc., that have some kind of connection to what we just read here in Ezekiel 47. Go. Let's do this. Let's kind of work through the text, kind of just seeing what Ezekiel 47 is saying here. As we go, I'll maybe give you opportunity to connect passages to specific points, and then we're going to open it up to a larger discussion about kingdom of God in Christ, and in that can be more of a free-for-all, share other ideas that you guys talked about with other passages. So, what Ezekiel sees is water coming out of the temple, right? And it begins as a trickle from the altar, runs out of the east gate, and it progressively gets deeper and deeper until it is basically impossible to pass. Okay, so maybe we're not going to be able to stop ourselves from just talking about all of it, but just this idea of this first image here of Ezekiel sees a little trickle of water, and then he sees it as it flows out, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it's a rushing torrent of a river. Okay, just that idea of the river itself. What did that remind you of? What other images, pictures in the Bible came to mind? Yeah, thank you, John. And good job with the names. There's river in Eden. I don't know if we mentioned that in our discussion in this class of Eden, but that's a kind of an easy detail to forget from the account in Genesis 1 and 2, that there were rivers flowing out of Eden to the rest of the world. Okay. Other things that came to mind when you just saw this picture of a trickling stream that became a rushing river. Yeah, and what is the Arabah, by the way, Ryan? Yeah, and the main body of water in the Arabah is the Dead Sea, right? So yeah, so you're picturing geography, as Brian says, going to go north from there. That Jordan River runs south from some higher elevations north of the Sea of Galilee into the Sea of Galilee, and then farther down. And the psalmist from time to time will use that imagery of kind of the trickle of water down from the mountains into the Jordan River as a kind of an image of refreshment, right? So there'd be some connection there. Oh yeah. Yeah, remember Steve's talk about blood not too long ago? Talking about you could actually see, historically speaking, the blood kind of flowing over the side of the temple wall. So you're kind of mixing that image there. By the way, Albert in our discussion also mentioned like the stopping of the waters at the Red Sea or the Jordan. So it's kind of like the opposite of that. Here we're seeing the kind of increasing of waters as opposed to the power of God to cut it off, right? Other thoughts on just the river here? Yeah, Brian?
In the Old Law and the New Covenant as well, it shows up in Revelations in the heaven, the city of God.
Okay, well, let's pause there. So we'll say it's there, and then we'll keep going here. So the water here that's flowing goes into the Dead Sea, and the effect is that the Dead Sea is reversed. It's made undead. It's enlivened. Everything lives where this river goes. So I think the idea is that all along the way, as it flows through the desert, it's making that desert an inhabitable land. And then as it flows into the Dead Sea is totally transformed to bring forth life. And so you have fish teeming in the newly enlivened Dead Sea. And all along the way, you have flourishing trees with fruit and leaves, both of which serve their beneficial purpose. The fruit for food and the leaves for healing. Okay, now that we've seen the rest of it, what other, we've heard some good conversation for several minutes here. What other passages were coming to mind as we see the whole picture here of not just the rush of water, but the teeming of life from it? John Albert?
Rivers of living water.
Yeah, that's one maybe worth reading real quick here. Before I get there, does anybody remember what Jesus says is the water in that analogy? Going once, going twice?
Talking about the Spirit.
He is, yes, that's right. So in John 7:37, Jesus says on the last day it says on the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and cried out, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." Now, he said this about the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were to receive. For as yet the Spirit had not been given, because Jesus was not yet glorified. Okay, so John 7, the rivers of living water flowing out of the believer. Other passages that came to mind in seeing this picture of the life-giving waters. Brian?
I believe it's the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well.
Yeah, I almost gave you that myself. I thought, well, maybe somebody will come up with it. But yes, in John 4, just a little bit earlier, he says that if you drink this water, you will never be thirsty again. John 4, verse 14, the water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. And so twice there in John, he uses that same basic image of water welling up inside of a person, John 4, and then flowing out to other people in John chapter 7. Okay. Other connections to the river, to the life from the river. Yeah, so I both of those work. Okay, so double points, Bethany. The water from the rock is maybe the first half of this, where it's water from nothing. It trickles out. You see the kind of miraculous nature of that. Okay, there's no tributaries here, and so what's being described here is really physically impossible. That a trickle can just become on its own accord a rushing river. Okay. But then the idea of bitter water being made sweet, that is the account in the wilderness of what Moses does for the people. Other people do it too. Elisha does it, or something similar to that in his time. Similar idea. Other connections? Yeah, Brian.
Let's go back to the passage where the water will remain salty.
Yes, well, at least the marshy area, verse 11, swamps and marshes will not become fresh; they are left for salt. Was there another passage you connected to that?
That's my contribution right now.
The verse exists. Yeah.
The parable that, of fresh water can't yield salt water, something along those lines.
So you may notice I didn't even refer to that really in your handout, verse 11. Anybody want to take a guess? Not that we know, I guess, but I have thoughts. What are your thoughts on why it says that there is salt left in the marshes, or some of the marshes are left with salt? Okay. In what sense? For what purpose? Is anybody in here now or in the past use some kind of product that was derived from Dead Sea salts? That's like a big deal, right? This is a tourist thing. I'm sure they just take Morton salt and dump it in and say, $15 for Dead Sea salt. That's my thought, and Harrison's referring to other passages that talk about salt having its use, right? The Dead Sea is a dead place, and it's enlivened and brought with abundant life, but salt has its purpose, and even the Dead Sea had its benefits, and so that's not taken away. It still retains some of that usefulness, even as it's transformed, okay? So let's get to this here. It's a really cool image. It's miraculous. It's another thing, by the way, that points to this not being a literal picture of what's going to happen in the future, because this can't really happen. But what does it tell us? If all of this is a looking forward to the kingdom of God in Jesus now and in eternity, what is these dozen or so verses here? What does it tell us about God, about God's kingdom? What does it mean for us? What would you say about that? Mike, let's start with you.
Revelation.
No.
You have been all class, but very clearly, Revelation 22, the first couple of verses of it almost speak to this perfectly as to what eternity will look like in that kingdom.
Yeah, it says, the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. Also on either side of the river, the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruits, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. We can go on, but that's good enough. But even that, my follow-up question would be that, would say, okay, yes, this shows up again in Revelation, but still these symbols have some kind of meaning. There's a message trying to be communicated to us about the kingdom of God now and forever. So what is that message? John Albert?
Spread of the gospel, kind of looking at the points that where we see it go from Acts forward, that it starts off small and then it grows, and then it takes that which is dead, uninhabitable, turns it into inhabitable, gives life, and as well, the healing. I think that there's some ties that could be made to that.
Several things there. The small to big, right? A little leaven leavens the whole lump. Jesus uses that kind of language. The John 7 thing, it flows out. John 4, each person themselves is transformed or filled with the water of life, but then John 7, that flows out. So yes, Ezekiel 47 is a picture of that life flowing out to save souls, to bring people to life, to bring them out of death into life, so on and so forth. So you can make all those kinds of connections. Robert, more on that?
Yeah, so you started it. Don't ever point Isaiah 2 back to me, because it started with you. But in verse 3, after they flow up to the house of God, he will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem.
Very cool. And by the way, this is a little bit it's a little bit interesting that this is the way that this goes, because see if I can get you to say it, not me. So much of the emphasis just a few chapters earlier on the walls and the gates was about what? What did we say? We said it several times. What was the keeping what in? Keeping the holiness in and keeping the uncommon out. So is it a little bit surprising then that with that image of the temple, we have then in chapter 47 the water of life that does go out, and it goes out and fills the whole earth and brings life to the whole earth? It's like, oh, both of those things are somehow true in God's kingdom, that there is an emphasis on protection and holiness and keeping out, right, what is unholy. But at the same time, there is an emphasis on the life of God going out to save souls, to take the life to dead places, so on and so forth. Steve, are you going to jump in on that?
Somewhere around in there, verse 4 or something, righteousness like a never-ending stream.
Yep. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Yeah.
I don't
That's
know.
it.
I felt like that. I think in a sense that fits.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Brian?
Clearly, we're healed when we're baptized, just as Naaman was healed as a prophetic figure of baptism.
Yeah. No, we want to be careful, obviously, but I would think, there's so much significance given to water in Old Testament and New Testament. Baptism plays such a central, role in the Bible story in Jesus that, it's almost a sure bet that anytime you see water, and especially the symbolism of water bringing life, then, baptism's got to be, closely related to that. And even just some of the stories we mentioned earlier, how many times God uses water, right, to give life. That's what water is it not? No water, no life. So water equals life in that sense. Okay. Other thoughts on what we're learning in Ezekiel 47 about the nature of God's kingdom? Sorry, guys. Albert?
Questions kind of come up, but like with the last part, you have it there on banks, flourishing trees with fruit. Wisdom says that the closer you are to the water, you're going to thrive. And so spiritually, the closer we are to God, we will thrive and be able to expand and grow his kingdom, as well as preserve ourselves and to avail of heaven. To where the opposite is, the farther away from the water, you'll perish. And so just question, are we the trees in this and the fruit, or we will be able to partake of trees and fruit? And, the leaves for healing, that would be for us, the people, but just questions that popped in my head.
Yeah. No, I think it'd be all of it. Again, using the John 4, John 7, combination. John 4 is you drink of the water, you're never thirsty again. John 7 is then you take it to other people. So you're both. You are the tree planted by the water. By the way, you saw the maybe allusion to Psalm 1, right? Its leaf will not wither. Whatever he does, it will prosper. That's the picture of the wise, righteous, man who meditates on the law of the Lord in Psalm 1. And so the same idea of the trees here, but we're also the water that is going out or maybe say the water is going forth from us. I don't know, but we see ourselves in multiple aspects, I think, of this imagery. John?
Is there an element here that is the law and the gospel, and salvation was maybe present and real at the altar at the temple, but it took the gospel to come to bring the trees and the men fishing and all of the actual life?
Yeah, you see elements of this in the temple. In fact, one thing comment I saw, which was interesting, I don't have diagrams for you, but it says that the trickle of water starts on the south side of the altar. Well, in Solomon's temple, what would have been about there is, remember there's a big basin that they used to wash their hands, and it was actually called the sea, right? It's a pretty big basin, but still just a basin. They called it the sea, the Bronze Sea. And one idea about that is that it called the sea. I was mentioning this to Albert. The Israelites were not alone in this, but the Israelites in particular, because they were not seafaring people, they were always very terrified of the sea, and the sea represented to them chaos and disorder and fear and all this stuff. And so the basin being called the sea may be a picture of, chaos contained, right? Like God encircles the sea. I mean, there's language in the Psalms about that. He's the one that says the sea, you can go this far but no farther. Maybe that's in Job, I don't know. So you see elements of that in Solomon's temple, but to your point, in the gospel, that basin tips over almost, and the water then flows out to then bring blessing and life to other people. Okay, although we shouldn't neglect the fact that even Israel was supposed to be a nation that brought life to other people. We'll see another reference to that in a minute. But Israel was always supposed to be a light to the nations. They were not ever supposed to be just, we keep the holiness here, we keep the blessing here, and enjoy it ourselves. That's kind of what they became, even though they missed the blessing too, but they were always supposed to take it to others. Brian?
The basin, the water, isn't that where the priests also cleanse themselves before entering?
Why, yeah, it was involved in the purification
So there's
process.
more purification showing life.
Yeah. And maybe this was where John was going as well, where it was referring to the water coming from the altar. Okay, so now I'm thinking of all kinds of things, but it's like we've emphasized the altar as being the atonement, the cross, obviously the fulfillment of that. So, conceptually from the cross then flows life to all nations. Then maybe even think of John 19, right? What came out of Jesus' side, right? Blood and water. I don't know. So then, it's too much fun. Okay. Anything else you want to say about this awesome picture here of the water flowing out and the significance of it? One more thing that hasn't been said, and some ways just circling back to what Mike said about this showing up in Revelation. Really, Revelation is in many ways kind of there are many in between, but kind of the end of a triad of pictures, right? Revelation 22 is clearly pointing back to Ezekiel 47, but Ezekiel 47, as we've already mentioned, is also clearly pointing back to Genesis 1 and 2. So Genesis 1 and 2 is creation, everything as it should be, waters flow out, the food that God has given in these trees is intended for man to enjoy for his benefit. Ezekiel 47 is a picture of that, waters flowing out, garden being created, life teeming, right? Just like in Genesis 1, the teeming of sea creatures, okay? And then Revelation 22, this is creation restored. This is new heavens, new earth. This is God kind of bringing his people back and dwelling with them in the kind of relationship that he always had designed for them, okay? All right. Doors are opening, and Dan's counting, so we'll move ahead here. We can do the rest of this fairly quickly. The rest of the book, like I said, is the division of the land. And so there may be still handouts, maybe you still have yours. I have them on the screen here. There's a handout that on one side has the land divided up. On the other side has the holy district mapped out for you. So if you have that, you can see it more closely. But what we find in the rest of 47 is that the land is divided. There is an emphasis, again, on equality or on equity, on fairness. Each tribe has its own space that is equal, and it's at least in the north to south distance. Joseph, and I put the passage there from 2 Chronicles 5 on your handout. It's interesting 2 verses to go read. It basically just explains how the birth order of the sons of Jacob got rearranged. Reuben lost his firstborn status, and Joseph moved into the firstborn status. although Judah was the one from whom the ruler was going to come. All that's explained in second, like, oh yeah, we don't read First Chronicles very much, but those 2 verses are worth reading. So Joseph is the firstborn for all practical purposes, and so he gets to the Ephraim and Manasseh portion. Okay, the text goes on in the next few verses to give you the outer edge, the outer boundary, which is similar to what was divided up, or to what was established in Numbers. Although, and I don't really know why exactly this is, but the area east of the Jordan, so if you're looking at your map, you would remember that in the days of the Israelites, they lived, 2.5 tribes lived over here. In Ezekiel's vision, that land is not part of the inheritance, so you have kind of a wonky shape here. Okay. There's 3 verses that talk about the land being their inheritance. That's always the language, but it's also an inheritance for the sojourner. And I gave you one verse. You could find several others in the law of Moses even that talk about the sojourner, the foreigner, the stranger was supposed to be taken care of in the land of Israel. And so here too, the sojourner, the foreigner, finds a home in the land. Okay. And then they're listed in chapter 48, and it goes through and gives you this exact listing. It's listed north to south, and the way it works is that it describes, the 7 tribes that are north of the holy district, and then chapter 48 takes, verses 8 to 20, 8 to 22, sorry. So most of chapter 48 kind of describes again in detail the sacred portion that looks like this. There's a section of land for the temple, section of land for the priests, for the Levites, for a city, and for people to farm on. And then the prince has the rest of this territory east and west of the temple. But that's in the middle, sacred portion. And then there are 5 tribes to the south of the sacred portion. And they are listed in verses 23 to 29. Okay. Just for fun, I mean, this is maybe interesting, but I don't know what the use is necessarily. A couple things. One, reading this passage reminds you a lot of the book of Numbers. If you remember, there was a detailed plan in the book of Numbers of where the tribes camped, and they each had their place, and it was kind of centered around different construction, kind of around instead of just up and down, but around the tabernacle in the middle. But there were 3 tribes to the north, 3 tribes to the east, west, south. Even the dividing up of the land kind of has that feel to it when you're reading. It lists the tribes that are to the north, then it describes the holy area, and then it describes the rest of the tribes to the south. Okay. But one thing you see here, at least best anyone can tell, is there seems to be some significance related to these sons of Jacob and who they came from. Okay. So the tribes that are farthest away from the holy district here are the children of the concubines, Bilhah and Zilpah in the Genesis story. And the tribes that are closer to the holy district are those that are of Leah and Rachel themselves. Okay, again, what all that means, I don't know, but that's what people have pointed out. I kind of like this better. To me, this is more interesting and maybe says easy to get the meaning of this. Look right in the middle. The 2 tribes closest to the sacred portion are Judah and Benjamin. But what do you notice about this arrangement that's different from the old arrangement? So Benjamin was largely absorbed into Judah. Geographically, they were flipped. Benjamin was north. The territory was north of Judah. Judah was to the south. And here they're flipped, which to me is kind of a way of showing, like, look, this is the 2 rods coming together as one. There's no more of this old kind of north versus south business. This is all the tribes under one prince living in one land. Okay. John's comment in some ways opens a can of worms, but I'll just kind of peek it open for you here a little bit. I think this map is probably more correct because the text says that the portions allotted to the tribes are equal. So this map tries to show you equal portions. If you do that, then the sacred portion ends up being in a spot that's not where Jerusalem was before. Okay? Jerusalem would be like more down here. Okay? A lot of maps that you'll see kind of skew the proportions of the tribes. They make all these tribes down here really skinny and all these tribes up here really fat so that the sacred portion can be right where Jerusalem is. And again, a lot of that is because there's this idea that all this is going to happen someday. There's going to be a, this millennial kingdom or something established in Jerusalem. We're going to rebuild the temple and all this stuff. You may have noticed, I don't know if we've even mentioned it, this city is never called Jerusalem, by the way, in Ezekiel 40 to 48. So that's one thing. But also this map that's, not just this map, but the dimensions described, the geography described in chapter 48 seems to indicate that the temple itself and the holy place is not even where Jerusalem would have stood in the land. Okay, so there's more evidence to this not being a literal, fulfillment to be built, to be accomplished at some point. Okay, but that's what basically the rest of chapter 48 is about. And then here's your objective to memorize the last 4 words of Ezekiel. The city is described in verses 30 to 35. Very similar to Numbers. You have 3 gates for 3 tribes on north, south, east, and west of the city. And the name of the city is, the Lord is there. The Lord is there. And again, that's essentially, the answer to all of the judgment at the beginning of the book. This is the message. This is the point of the complicated temple vision in chapter 40 to 48. It really all boils down to this. Ezekiel is looking forward to a time in which God will be there with his people, living with them. Okay. So, was there another bell? Thank you, Alex. So, we'll stop there. That's the end of the book. And we'll do some review exercises and such on Sunday. Thank you, guys.